What patterns do we get if we consider the inheritance of two genes at the same time? This is what Mendel called dihybrid inheritance. Dihybrid inheritance or dihybrid cross is a genetic cross or a breeding situation that relates to just the inheritance of two traits or features. When Mendel considered the inheritance of two characteristics at the same time, he followed essentially the same procedure as with his monohybrid experiments. In one investigation, he crossbred plants that were homozygous for round and yellow seeds with plants homozygous for wrinkled and green seeds. As we can see from the diagram, Mendel used two parental generations, round yellow-seeded pea plants crossed with wrinkled green-seeded pea plants. In this cross-pollination, the gametes for round and yellow-seeded pea plants are capital R, capital Y, capital R, capital Y, capital R, capital Y, and capital R, capital Y. For wrinkled and green-seeded pea plants, the gamete can be small r, small y, small r, small y, small r, small y, and small r, small y. When Mendel crossed homozygous for round and yellow-seeded pea plants with homozygous for wrinkled and green-seeded pea plants, he obtained 16 possible offsprings in F1 generation. We can see this cross by using Punnett square. As you can see from the diagram or Punnett square, the gametes for homozygous for round and yellow-seeded pea plants can be capital R, capital Y, capital R, capital Y, capital R, capital Y, and capital R, capital Y. The gametes for homozygous for wrinkled and green-seeded pea plants can be small r, small y, small r, small y, small r, small y, and small r, small y. When these four possible gametes of two traits or genes randomly fused, 16 possible offsprings could be produced. All these 16 possible offsprings were phenotypically the same. Let us see the cross. When gamete capital R capital Y randomly fused with gamete small r small y, it produced offspring like capital R small r capital Y small y. Capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produces capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it gives capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. Capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it gives capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. When capital R capital Y fused with small r small y, it produced capital R small r capital Y small y. When we see the genotypic and phenotypic ratio can be all are capital R small r capital Y small y. Phenotypic ratio all are round and yellow seeded pea plants. All the F1 plants had round and yellow seeds. This shows that round and yellow alleles dominant over the wrinkled and green alleles. Mendel then allowed F1 plants to self-pollinate or self-fertilize themselves. Let us see how all the F1 plants, that is, round and yellow-seeded pea plants, segregate to produce gametes. F1 plants have genotype capital R, capital Y, small y. When this genotype segregate and produce, the gamete can be capital R, capital Y, capital R, small r, capital Y, small y. These four different types of gametes formed by heterozygotes produce 16 possible combinations in the Punnett square. There is one thing we should notice. We can determine number of gametes and number of offsprings by using formula to the power of n. Number of gametes can be determined by using the formula to the power of n. N here stands to number of traits. So n in dihybrid inheritance is 2. That means to the power of 2, which is equal to 4. So in dihybrid inheritance, there would be 4 possible gametes when the two genes are non-linked. And also, we can determine number of offspring by using the same formula to the power of n. N here stands to number of gametes in non-linked genes, which is 4 to the power of 4 is equal to 16, which means there would be 16 possible offsprings in dihybrid inheritance of non-linked genes. When these gametes self-fertilize, which means when capital R, capital Y possibly fused with capital R, capital Y, this produced capital R, capital R, capital Y, capital Y. When gamete capital R, capital Y fused with gamete capital R, small y, this could form capital R, capital R, capital Y, small y. When capital R, capital Y fused with small r, capital Y, it produced capital R, small r, capital Y, capital Y. When capital R, capital Y fused with small r, small y, it produces offspring capital R, capital Y, small y. When capital R, small y fused with capital R, capital Y, it produced capital R, capital Y, small y. When capital R, small y fused with capital R, small y, it produced capital R, small y. When capital R, small y fused with small r, capital Y, it produced capital R, capital Y, small y. When capital R, small y fused with small y, it produced capital R, small y, small y. When small r, capital Y fused with capital R, capital Y, produced capital R, capital Y, capital Y. When small r, capital Y fused with capital R, small y, it produced offspring capital R, capital Y, small y. When small r, capital Y fused with small r, capital Y, it produced small r, capital Y, capital Y. When small r, capital Y fused with small y, it produced small r, capital Y, small y. When small y fused with capital R, capital Y, it produced capital R, capital Y, small y. Small y fused with capital R, small y, it produced capital R, small y, small y. When small y fused with small r, capital Y, it produced small r, capital Y, small y. When small y fused with small y, it produced small r, small y, small y. So in F2 generation, there would be 16 possible offsprings, which shows triangle-shaped arrangement in Punnett square. Phenotypically, there would be 9 round and yellow-seeded pea plants that form big triangle in the Punnett square. 3 round green forms medium-sized triangle. 3 wrinkled yellow-seeded also form the smallest triangle in the Punnett square. And lastly, there is only one homozygous wrinkled and green-seeded pea plants that tucked away in the bottom right hand corner of the Punnett square. So, in the F2 generation, the other two features reappeared but in new combinations, as we can see from the Punnett square. These two other features that reappeared in new combinations are round and green and wrinkled and yellow. So the phenotypic ratio can be 9 round and yellow to 3 round and green ratio, 3 wrinkled and yellow ratio, 1 wrinkled and green. That means 9, 3, 3, 1 ratio. Dihybrid test cross or dihybrid back cross. To find out if an organism is homozygous or heterozygous for a dominant trait, breeding experiment must be carried out on dihybrid inheritance. There are more possibilities than monohybrid inheritance. To study dihybrid test cross, let us stick with round seeds and yellow seeds as our example. In this case, the genotypes for dominant traits could be heterozygous for both features, that is, capital R, small r, capital Y, small y, or homozygous for both features, capital R, capital R, capital Y, capital Y, or heterozygous for color, capital R, capital R, capital Y, small y, or heterozygous for shape, capital R, small r, capital Y, capital Y. Crossing with recessive type small r, small r, small y, it gives the following possible outcomes. If the plants produced show all four possible phenotypes, the original was heterozygous for both features. If the plants produced all have round, yellow seeds, the original was homozygous for both features. If the plants produced all have round seeds, but some have green and some have yellow seeds, the original was heterozygous for seed color only. If the plants produced all have yellow seeds, but some are round and some are wrinkled, the original was heterozygous for seed shape only.